I think this idea that work is what you do, not where you go, has been a change that has really accelerated over the last 5 years. Of course, there's some jobs and roles that will always require being in person, that sort of 9 to 5 time scale, being in a set office, a set desk, doing the same job day in, day out. But for a lot of people, that has really changed over the last 5 years. And the pandemic did accelerate a necessary shift in that for a lot of organizations.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of the Technology Boardroom. Today's session, we're going to be talking about putting the power of technology in our clients' hands. So very much focused around end users, how end users are using some of this fantastic technology that's out there, but actually looking at it from a more critical perspective potentially and going, actually, is this working for our users? And is it getting in the way of our users and how they use the technology? So today, my name is Peter Wilson. So I'm here to help with this podcast today, joined by Rob Smith. Rob, do you want to just do a quick introduction?
Yeah, hi Pete. So always a pleasure to be here. So as you say, I'm Rob Smith, and I'm the partnerships director at Advania. But I guess fundamentally, I'm an end user as well. So despite sort of, I've got a bit of a techie background. If you go back far enough, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of that at some point. But I'm an end user. I still have to use this stuff. I still have to use the same technology. I face the same challenges as everybody else. And I'm really interested to have a chat about not only how do we make use of this technology and help our clients make use of it, but how do we do that in a way that's secure and responsible, to make sure that data isn't going off into the ether and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, good to have a chat about it.
Excellent. And, just to fill in a little bit more about me, I've worked here for just shy of 30 years.
Mm.
And on some of the other episodes, people have been having a jibe about my age and some of the technologies I've seen over the years. But it's all focused around how our users are using technology. And absolutely, over those 30 years, the way we've been able to use technologies changed massively. So, it's probably worth starting there. If we think about the last, I don't know, 5 years, what do you think the biggest changes are and the biggest things, that a user has had to deal with in the last, say, 5 years?
Yeah, a great question. And I promised myself I wasn't going to talk about the pandemic, but with that question, I don't think I've got a choice. So let me take a step back and sort of sum it up, and then I'll go into some of the detail. So fundamentally, I think this idea that work is what you do, not where you go, has been a change that has really accelerated over the last 5 years. There's some jobs and roles that will always require being in person, that sort of 9 to 5 time scale, being in a set office at a set desk, doing the same job day in, day out. But for a lot of people, that has really changed over the last 5 years. And the pandemic did accelerate a necessary shift in that for a lot of organizations. So technology companies like ourselves, I guess, had a bit of a leg up on this, and we were doing a lot of this already. But for a lot of people, this was the first time as an end user, as a business, as both of those things, where you had to deal with this reality of not being able to go into an office, but still needing to do your job. So the idea of starting with a device that lets you do that, and appropriate sort of security and controls and management wraps that go around that device and that end user experience to make sure that they can be productive, but in a way where the business's data is still protected, all the way through to sort of unified communications technologies, Teams and Zoom and that sort of thing, to allow people to be present when they're not present. And that use of presence is a really interesting one, because using technology like Teams is not just the same as picking up a phone and having a conversation. It's the place you go to do your work, a bit like your office. So rather than turning up and commuting to an office and doing it, now you log into Teams or Zoom or other technologies are available, and that's where you go to do everything that you're doing. And it's the hub of your day job, if you like. And 5 years ago, this was unheard of. So if we go back to that sort of time, the expectation was that people would still be in the office most of the time. There was a little bit of work from home, but it was sort of, oh, you finish early on a Friday and you catch up on your emails. But now that's becoming a reality for a lot of people. That I mean, I'm fully remote. I've and have been for 8 years, right? So I'm used to this experience of not being in an office except when it's needed and appropriate. But for a lot of people, this was a seismic change, and the pandemic accelerated that need. And I'm really interested to see your thoughts on whether we're starting to see any sort of backslide on that, or whether it's still the nirvana that everyone believed it to be at the time.
It's funny because, very much like yourself, Rob, I've worked remotely for a lot of time. I live out in the wilds of North Lancashire,
Yeah.
and going into an office is a fair old trek for me. So for me, working remotely has been a boon because I can make very much more use of my time for work, but also then personal perspective. So it's been fantastic. And I think the tools that we have available to us today enable that capability fantastically well. So, you could say that, yes, I'm remote, but actually I'm more in communication with my colleagues than I ever was
Yeah.
because of the fact we've got IAM, because we've got video, because we've got voice. All of these tools together are actually making us much, much more connected. And if I was sat in an office, I'd probably still be IMing and still talking to people in the same method, even if I'm sat two desks away from them.
Exactly what I was just going to say. This idea of commuting into an office to then sit on a Teams call with your colleague that sat three desks away. Just it doesn't. It never seems to make sense to me. And I'm really as an end user, so not as an employee of a technology company or anything like that, but as an end user, I really value that remote working experience. I really value the extra time that gives me with my family and my friends and my hobbies and my home life and all of that sort of wonderful stuff isn't impacted by this. Again, I'm a bit like you. I live out in the depths of deepest, darkest Leicestershire, and a commute into an office for me is quite substantial. That being said, there are times where it is right and appropriate and valuable to make that journey and to be in the office and to collaborate with others. But it's the fundamentally this idea that, again, coming back to what I said right at the start, work is what you do, not where you go. If the tooling and the tech and all of that sort of wonderful stuff lets me do my job as well, or arguably in some instances better from a remote location, then we should absolutely make use of that. But there's also this, if I look at that sort of perfect pyramid of success and for sort of satisfaction from an end user perspective and a business perspective, you always have this concept of people, process, and technology. And I think the technology is there. I think the technology is streets ahead of where it was 5 years ago and is now truly able to deliver that remote working experience. Some people still really thrive on an office environment. So I don't see that ever changing in its entirety. Whereas some people thrive a little bit more on a remote basis. But the idea of in-person connection is still important. The bit where I've seen a little bit of challenge, I guess, from all organizations and that starts to impact end users is the process bit. So the idea of how does a business operate in a way, not just from a technology perspective, but from a process perspective, that means those employees that choose to engage remotely are not third party citizens. They've got the same experience, be that interacting with colleagues, be that promotion opportunities, what visibility type stuff. How do you see that as being a challenge for end users?
And I think it is a challenge. And you'd reference there that you think the technology is there to support it all now. I'm not sure it fully is yet.
Okay.
I still think there are bits missing. I go into the office because I want to have physical face-to-face conversations with, when I'm managing my team, for example. I actually want to sit in front of them to see the body language properly, to understand them as a person. I
Mm.
don't think the technology gives us that just yet. But also, real collaboration that you get from sitting around a whiteboard drawing pictures on a whiteboard that everybody can comment on. I don't think the technology is quite there on that yet. So that the ability to collaborate, the ability to, dream up new solutions, new, answers to problems, I think that works still for me better in person. So, going into the office for that type of, round table conversation, collaboration, problem solving, I don't think the technology is quite there yet.
I'm just thinking because that raises an interesting point because we're talking in absolutes at the moment. We're talking about remote or in person, but there's obviously for a lot of people there's this hybrid world that exists in the middle, and that's where I would agree with you. So I think the technology works incredibly well if everybody is remote, and I think that equally there's tech that works incredibly well if everyone is in person. The gap for me has always been that hybrid experience, and taking your whiteboard type example, I'm a techie at heart and I like to draw things out on a whiteboard because that helps me figure out where we're going. You can't see it, but I've got a whiteboard next to me that I do exactly that on. And that experience still is not quite there for the end user from a hybrid perspective. There's challenges around camera setups and making sure people can see content. I think there are solutions to it, and I think there are, again, largely driven by the technology rather than the people or process part of that trifecta. But I think there are some solutions, but I agree. I don't think they're quite
Yeah.
at the point we'd all like them to be.
Just picking up on your other point around, things like being seen, promotion,
Yeah.
being
Mm.
part of the gang, if you like, that potentially you miss out on by being remote. Is that still the case? I do believe it is. I don't think
I
we've
agree.
quite got the culture right across our organization, across other organizations yet, to accommodate this change in working practices. So I think the culture piece is something that will develop over time. In pockets, it works really well, but as an overarching thing, I'm not sure it does. You know, us as an organization, we're spread out potentially globally if you take in, some of our colleagues that work in Africa. So, we're never going to sit down. Well, it's very unlikely we're going to sit down in the same office as they are, but we work well remotely. We do talk, we do communicate well as a group. So I think there are pockets where it's working really, really well. There are pockets where it isn't. And the other thing I would say is it really depends where you are in your career as to whether remote or in office works well. For we've been here for a long time. You can spot from the grey hair that we've been around the block a little bit.
A
So
little
we're
bit,
not
just a little. Yeah.
Indeed, yeah. We're not learning our trade in quite the same way that, let's say, a new starter that's just out of uni, or some sort of development type program. It needs to learn from the people that have done the job for some time. That is something that I believe that people miss out on if they're not in an office type scenario and learning from some of those that have done it before. I think that is somewhat missing at the moment, and the technology for me doesn't really help with that suggestion other than being on video calls every day with those individuals, which can get a bit clunky. They're not going to hear those snippets from somebody having a conversation 4 desks down about how did you do that particular piece of work. If you're sat in an office, you're going to hear that little overheard little comments that you can then go and say, oh, that was interesting to hear. Would you mind if we had a bit of a chat about it? You're going to miss out on that sort of thing,
And
using
it's
technology.
I agree, and you're absolutely right that particularly for early in career, that personal connection and those almost those water cooler type moments where you just happen to get pulled into a conversation that perhaps you wouldn't have done if you worked remotely, are super important. You hit the nail on the head as you sort of progress up an organization in terms of seniority, although I hate that word, but as you progress up into sort of more responsibility, it becomes less important, I think, about that being seen to be seen. I mean, we're both very lucky that if we need to talk to our CEO, we can pick up the phone and just have a conversation. Whereas somebody who was new into role, straight out of uni or straight out of school, looking to get involved in technology, it probably isn't going to feel comfortable having that same conversation. But if they happen to be stood next to each other in the kitchen making a coffee, that becomes a much easier conversation to have. So yeah, I think it sort of bringing us back to to the subject, I guess, about how this is all impacting the end user, I think that's a really interesting point, that it doesn't all stop at, it doesn't all start or end with the technology. It's the other stuff that wraps around it that's important as well.
I think the other thing that's changed probably in the last 5 years that's enabled us to work remotely from a technology perspective is communication. The way that we connect into the system. So for me, living out in the middle
Right.
of the nowhere, my broadband going into real technical stuff is terrible. I can get 1 meg out of my fiber. I don't even have fiber. Copper broadband. It probably isn't even copper, to be honest. So, I've reverted to many different technologies over the years, and I'm now on a satellite system. I won't mention who provided by whom.
Understand.
Um, and it works wonderfully, and it enables me to work remotely from anywhere. I've got one that can go in the van. I've got a camper van, so I can work remotely. As long as I can see the sky, I can be productive anywhere on what is a business grade circuit. So the technology absolutely has enabled that capability. And if I throw that to our clients a little bit more rather than me working at home, let's think about organizations where potentially you might need to work remotely, maybe a new startup building site, maybe somebody working in a forestry type environment or somewhere else that's very remote. The connectivity is now there so that those people can work as if they were in the office. So all of that capability is now changed. It really doesn't make any difference where anybody is. You can do everything that you need to as part of a role. There are really no limitations anymore in terms of the technology.
And it's a really interesting point, because I think, and we're guilty of it, and we've done it today as well. Is you fall into the end user, sort of the visible end user tech stack, if you like.
Yeah.
But then you have to think about the infrastructure and the underpinning, how you actually get the pipe that gets you to the
Mm,
data and to the internet. That matters.
mm,
And I'm very similar. Up until recently, I lived really rurally, and the broadband was not the greatest, and I had to do something similar to you to make sure I always had the right connection, and was privileged to be able to do that. Not everybody could. But when you start to look not just as that infrastructure stuff, but all of the other technology wrap that goes around the visible end user experience. So if I'm an end user and I work remotely, and it's a good example is my team. My team is incredibly geographically spread. So I've got people as far north as sort of the Scottish Highlands, and as far south as the as London and the South Coast. So um, never the twain shall meet in terms of them all being in the same place. And one of them attended our offices, I think, twice. And it was probably 6 months before they attended the office for the first time. So they had a experience where a laptop got delivered to them by Royal Mail, arrived on their doorstep, and within minutes they were logged in and able to work in all of our corporate systems, all of our technologies, all of the stuff that they need to do their job, all the information. They had it all with it literally within 5 minutes of this thing arriving on their doorstep. 5 years ago, that would have been a challenge. 10 years ago, that would have been impossible. And there's a lot of stuff going on under the hood to make that happen. And I think it's probably a good segue to talk about the security side of things. And let's take that as an example. We've got a new employee. Obviously, we've done our appropriate vetting and interview process and all that sort of stuff, and we've decided they're the right person for the job. And then I've shipped them a laptop with effectively the keys to the kingdom on it. They've got access to all our data, all our information. How do we keep that secure, and how do we make sure that that end user, should they choose to do something nefarious with it, can't?
Now there's a question. I could probably talk for hours and hours on all of the pieces that can come to play to make that work. But let's talk about a few elements in there. And the first thing I want to talk about is overarching security has to be embedded into everything we do. So I won't pick up on the comment you said about the keys to a castle and access to all the data. Nobody should ever have access to all of the
Very
data.
true.
So
Very true.
first point. Second point, obviously, when we're delivering a new device to a user, there will be security around that. So, with the TPM chips that are built within the devices, obviously there's security
Just
enabled
for our,
within that.
just for our listeners that may not know, what's a TPM chip?
I knew you were going to ask me what the abbreviation stands for, and I
I
don't know off the
I can
top of my
help
head.
you. It's a
Well,
trusted protocol module. I'm
thank you.
showing my techie side from I used to back in my Microsoft days, I used to be very heavily involved in Windows and devices. So I remember TPM chips well and the challenge with them. But yeah, it's trusted protocol module. Effectively, it's doing some security stuff for distinct to the rest of the device so that it's ring fenced and more secure than if you were just using the normal processor, effectively.
Absolutely. And what it's doing is it actually within the device, it's using that chip to encrypt information that's on the device. And that encryption is specific to that device, if that makes sense. But
Yeah.
obviously all of your end user authentications are then on that chip as well, so that you can then obviously log in remotely, not connected to the internet and such like. So that is adding massive amounts of security to what you do as an individual because everything on the device is encrypted and secure. So when that device is shipped to you, obviously that TPM chip is enabled, the encryption is enabled, so the data on that device is secure once it goes to you. So let's say it gets lost in transit, then well, the device is pretty much useless because not only is everything encrypted on it, the device is actually tied to your, let's say you're a Microsoft house, that device is tied to your Microsoft estate
Mm.
by the definition on that device. So again, you log it up, it's going to say welcome to Advania, and it doesn't matter really what you do to that device, it's always going to say welcome to Advania. So from an end user that's going to pinch it, well, it's pretty much useless, to be brutally honest. So that back end setup is absolutely critical. Now, the other piece I'd add to that is it's then going to use biometrics to log you in. And again, I'm going to do this from a Microsoft world because that's the world we live in pretty much day to day. But it's going to use my face to log into the system. So it's a really secure way of logging in because hopefully nobody else has got a face like this. So it's going to use my face to log into the system, which is secure. That image is stored on the TPM chip so that it will go wherever I go, it will go with me. So it's always nice and secure. So it's simple, it's effective. And for me, that's one of the key things about security. If security's in your face all of the time and asking you to put prompts in, MFA prompt, multi-factor authentication, sorry for those that don't understand MFA, it's going to get in the way. People are going to find ways around it. People are not going to use the security properly. So it's got to be seamless, it's got to be simple. And for me, that the simpler it is for the end user, the more secure your system is going to be. So
And that's a
logging in with your go on.
it's a really good example of, I guess, business necessity and sort of security necessity meeting end user functionality and creating something magical in the middle. So the TPM chip, that trusted protocol module, was created and put into devices to help make them more secure and to as you exactly as you just described, to keep the data and the information on that device safe and secure for the business. But what that TPM chip then does, working in concert with the appropriate cameras or fingerprint readers, is that's what allows this biometric login and better user experience. So hand on heart, I've not typed a password into my computer in 4 years. I turn up, I sit down, I look at it looks at me, it knows it's me, and suddenly I'm in and I'm doing everything I need to do. I don't need to
Yeah.
remember passwords. I certainly don't need to write them on post-it notes and stick them on monitors like the good old days. And that all came about, but you couldn't do that without that TPM chip, that trusted protocol module, providing that additional sort of control around it. So it's a really interesting way of saying, look, well, we did this thing. This thing was done solely a selfish thing for businesses, really, to keep their data safe. But actually, it's led to all of these
Absolutely.
user improvements for the end user, and it's a really good example of that happening.
And obviously, once you've done that authentication, then that's how the data then that you're producing is then controlled. Because we basically tying that data to the individuals using your login to make sure that that data is controlled, is not leaked across all over the place. Because we can actually put protection in the data now to say if that data does leave your organization, we can actually say, you know what, let's just stop anybody else accessing it because we can tie it to a set of users. So if data does leak, which it shouldn't, then we've still got control of it. So, there are many and varied security technologies we can use to enable us to work remotely so that, that data is going to, it is in effect coming out of the business to come to you. But we've got all of that security wrap around it. So it can be safe with the right, obviously, controls built in there. So, security, as I say, has to be embedded in everything, but the tooling is there to do it today.
And that concept of data security and that almost that rights management piece of saying, does the person trying to access this file, this document, this data, do they have the permissions to do so?
Yeah.
Rather than again, if we go back 5 years and beyond, you get the old school way of, well, I've password protected this Excel file, and then I've emailed 9 copies of that to 9 different people, all of which are now working on their own version that requires them to have this password that I've now had to email all of them as well. Now this idea, and we take it for granted, but this idea of a file held centrally in an area that everyone can get access to, and the permissions granted to the user dictate whether they can see it, edit it, view it, change it, whatever you've set it to be. An underrated change that we don't talk about enough, and it's become expected, and I'm really glad that it has, because going back even 5 years ago, people were still emailing those Excel spreadsheets, and occasionally you still see it. I always feel obligated to chip in and go, there's a better way you could do that. Why don't we try to do something that isn't 1995 and see if we can try to make it work a little bit better? But
Absolutely. And it then becomes seamless for the users to access the data because it's tied to your identity, which is the bit that obviously you're using to log into the device in the first place. So you don't need all of those extra passwords and things. So
and if
simple.
pardon me, and if the device is compromised, if it's lost or stolen or anything like that, or if the user leaves your organization or whatever, maybe they were using their own device rather than one that you provided for them or something, you don't need to worry about that as a concept, because you just remove access to the device, to the content, so that user is no longer authorized to view it. Or if it really gets to it, you issue a remote kill command to the device and wipe it in its entirety. So you've
Yes,
got so
absolutely.
much more control now than you used to have.
Now, obviously, a technology podcast in today's world, we haven't mentioned 2 letters yet, which is quite incredible, really. But I think we're going to have to mention the word AI
I was going to
somewhere
say
in
it
amongst
first. Yeah.
the conversation. Obviously, the world is changing. The world is using AI, and obviously, it's affecting end users hugely in terms of our work and how we use the tooling, how we create data, etc. I think it's probably worth, and I'll ask you as an end user, to give me your experiences of AI. Is it as game changing as everybody's telling us it is? Is it as good as everybody's telling us it is? I don't know. Just
Oh,
get your view on it. It's that
this-
I'm not trying to get you down a rabbit hole there, by the way.
no, big subject though. Um,
Indeed.
so the first thing I would say is AI means different things to different people. So if I go back to that 5 year period and I look at Microsoft Cortana as an example, this nice AI assistant that would help you do your job. Did it work particularly well? No, it didn't. And I'm
Yeah.
saying that as someone who was at Microsoft at the time. It didn't quite do what its aspiration was. It feels like we are now at a real turning point for AI capability, and the growth of this capability is exponential. If you look at and again, using the Microsoft text, I'm more familiar with it, but I think it applies to all AI systems. If you look at where the Microsoft AI stack was 12 months ago and compare it to where it is now, that growth it's not been linear. It's been a hockey stick, exponential growth in
Absolutely.
terms of the capability and competence and sort of what it can do for you. And I think it's worth saying that when we talk about AI from an end user perspective, it's probably the generative AI stuff that most end users have been exposed to. So the idea of AI that helps you create new content or review existing content, whether that's meeting notes or reviewing documents or contracts or whatever. I think that's where most end users are really getting value out of it at the moment. And as I say, I think it really is this turning point in
Mm,
terms of AI has crossed that threshold from being a um, almost an amusement to
mm,
actually being something that can really add value. Um, and it also feels like that growth is going to continue.
mhm.
And from an end user perspective, my biggest concern for not just myself but all end users is the learning curve on how to make use of that AI is the big thing that's going to start to potentially get in its own way, because even now it feels like if you're not on the AI bandwagon, or you're not jumping on it very, very soon, if you try to jump on 12 months down the line, you're going to have missed that boat, and you're going to be really fighting to catch up in terms of your knowledge as an end user of how to use this tech and where to use this tech. 'Cause I think that's arguably the more important bit. And it just feels like we really are at that moment in time where, whether love it, hate it, whatever your opinion of it is, you cannot ignore it, and you almost need to grasp that bull by the horns and go, right, we are going in, we are in on AI, we are whatever we're going to figure out how it works for us and where it adds value, but we can't ignore it, and we can't push it further down that track. We need to think about it now and start doing something with it.
100% agree. For me, AI is one of those end user tools. If we're just thinking about the generative stuff rather than the the back end systems that obviously can do all sorts of clever technology work. But let's think about this from an end user perspective. It's one of those pieces of tooling that's going to really help an end user become much, much more productive in terms of what they do. It's going to help you create better quality work because you're going to have more time to be able to review, to be able to edit, to be able to understand what you're trying to create. But are we there yet? The panacea of AI doing everything? No, not at all. Not anywhere close to that at this point in time. Does AI still make mistakes? Yes, absolutely, it does. So
Oh, it does. Yeah, it does.
some of the things that I've managed to create with AI have been terrible, but is it getting better? Yes, absolutely. It's one of those pieces of tooling that saves me as an individual, from an end user perspective, hours a week in terms of my time, and allows me to be more productive doing other things with people, spending the time actually speaking to people rather than actually having to create the documents. So it's a weird thing, that speaking to people,
I
but
know.
for me, still important. I think you're right. It is one of those game changing moments. Now, for me, AI is one of those things that shouldn't just be given to a user. I don't know what's your view on this. It should be given to a user, but then with training around it, because I think that's super, super important. I don't know what's your view.
You're right, and it applies obviously not just to AI, but to generally most end user technologies. It helps particularly if it's something new or groundbreaking or game changing. If you help people understand how they might use it, and I think AI is a good example. So if you just give users access to, let's say, Microsoft Copilot as an example, if you give them access to Copilot and say, go and make use of this and let us know how you get on, they're probably not going to have a very good experience. They're going to try it for a bit. It's going to be difficult. They're going to hit a blocker. The AI is going to give them a response they weren't expecting, or one that they know is incorrect, and they're going to
Mhm,
go, well, that's it, it's rubbish, it doesn't work, I'm not going to use it now.
mm,
Whereas actually giving those end users just a little bit of additional assistance, guidance, context around how you might want to use this tool, and then leaving them to find their own way within guardrails and with appropriate touch points for sort of refreshing that knowledge, I think is a really good way of doing it. So if I take a good example, traditional something we've seen a lot of end users doing is when they get access to this new AI stuff, they'll use it to do simple things like, well, go and go and look at my emails and tell me what I need to care about. One of the first prompts I use it at the start of every week. I won't go into it. It's a very, very long and complicated prompt, but it basically boils down to, what have I forgotten to do? How
mhm,
I get hundreds of emails a day. I promise you, I haven't read and dealt with all of them. What First of all, what have I forgotten about? Second of all, what is important? And that's
mhm.
the step. that a new end user wouldn't take. That
Mm,
idea of going, well, actually, I can use this thing to start not just helping me create some stuff, but actually go and start to make some decisions based on what it knows about me and my patterns and my plan, how I interact with stuff. So being able to go, well, I've had 100 emails, but actually, I'm probably copied on some of those. There's probably
yeah,
only an action on a few of them. Go and tell me what those actions are and what I need to do.
yeah,
And the next step, and this is where I'm really excited. I'm sure we'll do an episode about agents at some point. But the next step is then the AI that then goes and just takes an action preemptively for you based on
mm,
what you've told it. So
mm,
if the example being those emails, it's identified 3 emails where actually these 3 people need access to this file. Well, I've got an AI agent that will just go and do that for me. It'll check
yeah,
that they've got the permission. It will apply appropriate safeguards. It will give them access to the file and it will revoke it when they don't need it anymore. And it will
yeah,
just go and do that for me without me having to even be involved in that process.
yeah,
And the person on the other end won't know. They will
yeah,
just get access to the stuff they asked for. They won't know that it's I've done it or AI has done it. It will just happen. And
yeah,
I think that is where this end user training comes in, just helping people understand the art of the possible, but
yeah,
then grounding it in something that that user actually cares about. Because the fact that generative AI can make me a pretty picture of a bunny is fantastic and brilliant and great. And it still blows my mind occasionally that it can go and do this stuff, but it's not going to help me do my job. And that's where having that context really does help.
and I think, AI today, from an end user perspective, is different from a lot of other technologies we've been using over the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, in that a lot of technologies we've just given to users and say, go on, crack on. You'll work your way through it. I don't think AI is one of those. I think absolutely
I
we
agree.
need to make sure our users have got some training around prompting specifically. How to write a proper prompt is a skill. And, if you don't ask AI the right question, it will give you the wrong answer. I know that's a bit of an obvious statement, but it's absolutely key to make sure that people understand how to use those prompts to gain the full capability. So, for me, it's really, really key to taking AI forward and being effective from a user perspective with the tooling.
And
Now,
go
go
just
on.
going a step back as well. Just uh, if I take Microsoft's use of the word Copilot is, I think it was absolute genius because it really does describe what this process looks like as well.
Mm,
To some end users come in expecting AI to do things for them, and that
mhm,
might be a positive or a negative because there's connotations about people worried about is AI going to take their jobs and all that sort of stuff. But this concept of it being a co-pilot, not an autopilot, is a really easy way for end users to understand that look, it's there to help you, it's there
mm,
to take some of the heavy lifting, it's there to help you do your job, it's not there to do your job for you.
mm,
In the same way as, and definitely showing our age here, I used to deal with complicated contract agreements via fax machine. Now that just put that into a context. Now that moved into email, and then it moved into online self-service portals over a 20-year period. This is the same sort of thing. AI is we're not quite at the fact machine of AI, but we're at that cusp, that start, the
mm,
early point, and where it's going to be in 5 years' time honestly is anyone's guess. You hear a lot of people trying to make predictions. The growth is and of capability is
mm.
so exponential. I don't know where we're going to end up with this AI technology in 5 years. Maybe a year we could start to talk about, but 5 years it's going to be really challenging.
Agreed, and that was going to be my next question: is where do you see as in from an end user perspective in 5 years' time? And I agree. I don't think we can define that at this point because technology is changing so fast that maybe a year out we can have a good idea that we'll have more agents doing some of the mundane pieces for us. AI will interact with us more to take away a lot of that run rate stuff that really just gets in the way of us actually being creative in our roles. I think yes, AI is gonna do more in those areas, but yeah, 2, 3, 4, 5 years out, I've no idea. I think is what I would say at the moment.
I always like making predictions because either I'm going to be right and look amazing or wrong and no one will remember. So the one thing I think I agree on the AI point. I think that as a specific technology, it's difficult to put
mm,
a limit on where that capability might go. But I think more generally, if I was to look at sort of what will life as an end user look like in 5 years' time, I think this debate around where you work and when you work will have
mhm,
either gone away or significantly
mhm,
progressed. I think by that point, process people will have matured through businesses and potentially matured out of businesses. So
mhm,
technology will have improved, continued to improve, and processes will finally have caught up with this seismic shift and this almost treading water that everyone's had to do during that
mhm,
pandemic transition period. I think that artificial barrier between where and how and when you work, I think that will change quite significantly. I I don't think you'll see a mass return to mandatory office hours. I know some big tech companies have made the interesting decisions that that's the
mhm,
way to go, whereas others have taken the exact opposite, that
mhm,
opposite approach. I always lean towards the that Microsoft style approach of, look, it's work is what you do, not where you
mm,
go. And I
yeah,
think you'll see that grow over the next 5 years. And fundamentally, I think the life of an end user will be not not easier, because there's always new challenges coming out of the woodwork. But I think some of the bugbears and the points that end users at the minute arguably have to put up with, I
mhm.
think they will get smoothed out and ironed out over the next 5 years, and it will just be a much nicer experience. Even from the high point that we're starting at now, I think it will be an even better experience for end users in 5 years' time.
And I agree wholeheartedly. If I look where I was 5 years ago, I was working remotely at times 5 years ago. Is my world a lot easier and a lot better than it was 5 years ago? And am I able to work more effectively remotely? Absolutely, I am. And, that is going to continue. We know it's going to continue.
Mm.
So, it's quite where the technology is going to go. Who knows, really,
Yeah,
at this point in time? Because it's changing so fast. So, yeah, who knows? Right. So I think that's been a useful discussion.
I really enjoyed it. Yeah, really
Thank you,
nice.
Rob. I think that's been it's been good. Thank you to our listeners for joining us on the Technology Boardroom podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in our next episode. Thank you very much.